Welcome to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome, everyone, to Et Al., a podcast of Baylor University Press. We are here in Boston at the annual meetings of the Society of Biblical Literature and the American Academy of Religion, and I'm joined here by Autumn Ridenour. So Autumn Alcott Ridenour is the Mockler Associate Professor of Christian Ethics at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. She is also the author of Restlessness and Belonging, a brand new book out with Baylor University Press, and we are so excited to have you here and talk today.
Thank you, Josh. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, well, I'm actually going to spring a question on you that's not on our pre-approved question list here, if you don't mind.
That's fine.
But it's an easy one. So, you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you, is the most famous line from one of the most famous theologians of Christian history.
That's right.
St. Augustine in the Confessions. But this is also a book about technology. Now, Augustine did not know a lot of modern technology, presumably. So why turn to Augustine to answer questions about how Christians ought to navigate this world of ever-changing and evolving technological rupture?
Thank you for that question, Josh. And that really is a fundamental question behind this project. And I think it's in the very quotation you just mentioned that is so central to Augustine's theology, that to be human is to be restless, to be seeking to know and to be known. And of course, when you hear that phrase, that there's so much that's packed into that, right? You have made us for yourself. Our hearts are restless. They find rest in thee. But in many ways, the Confessions is his own search to know himself and to understand why, and his sense of restlessness that later, I think in chapter 3, I'll talk about the sense of fragmentation that Augustine was aware of, that in time we feel fragmented and our desires are all over the place. So there's an individual search that's going on, but then simultaneously this individual search to find rest is a social search, and there's restlessness in the community. And so if you go from Confessions being about the individual, the city of God is about the community, or the polis, the civitas, the republic. And in doing so, of course, he's challenging and living through the Roman Empire. And that's why I take on this question of empire, because he very much was aware of questions of power. And I used to talk about domination, libido dominandi, the desire to dominate the other, to seek to out of our own insecurity. So there's both this individual restlessness, but also a social restlessness. And I think this is how we bring in concepts around technology and how is it our new empire that we're living in and facing.
Right. Okay. So the kind of imperial domination that algorithms have now taken control. And so then how did this idea come to you? What was the kind of genesis of this project?
That's a great question. It really was 2014 is when I entered the college classroom. I had just received my PhD. I'd actually been on an unofficial maternity leave while doing a job search. And I entered in the classroom teaching 2014 and had 2 years off between writing a dissertation and the unofficial maternity leave. And so I just observed in the classroom the ways in which the phone was kind of leading student life. It led students into the classroom. There was not as much chatter. It led them around. And then, of course, it was observing in some ways your students, but then you look up and you're like, oh, this is not just students. This is me. This is my family. This is political life. This is everybody. This is our religious life. So there's a way in which Sherry Turkle says we have to be a stranger to the world in order to see clearly. And I don't know if it was in some ways just entering into the classroom at a time when I had 2 years off. And then later I went and read 2017, Jean Tweng's book, iGen, and she actually does make a diagnosis that it was around 2012 that they began to see steep shifts in behavior, because it was at that point the iPhone, which had been dropped, 2007, had become more of a regular household item. So in a sense, it became a larger part of the population, and we have to say it's not just the phones, but really it was the apps and the social media apps that were accessible on the phones, and the way that it was just changing the way we related to the world.
Yeah. And that way of relating you speak of in terms of kind of personal branding. So to read you a quote here, you say, when image becomes associated with self-branding, communication becomes reduced to performance. So how has self-image devolved into like the personal brand? And how is that influenced by a fear of exclusion?
Those are great questions. And yes, it's what I'm probing there in the first chapter, and it's a question throughout. And in many ways, you could go to, I quote, it was actually Jill Lepore, an article where she's quoting Zuckerberg, and he was talking about what is, the purpose behind Facebook and these social media apps. And he said it was for connection. And so part of it, I'm questioning connection, but for connection's sake of what? And so you have this kind of superficial understanding of connection. And actually, Tim Wu winds up saying in The Attention Merchants, this is what we're living as, an attention economy, right? That's kind of racing to understand us psychologically. The brains tend to get us hooked to watch more, which is kind of the hacking of our social desire to be known, to belong. And in doing so, Tim Wu says that the most economic, astute thing that Zuckerberg did was Facebook became the place to be. And if you weren't on it, then you were missing out. Of course, we use that phrase, FOMO, all the time.
Right.
But in missing out, you felt that you had to be there to be seen or to be a part of the community. And then in doing so, it plays into what Sherry Turkle has said in her various volumes, this performance identity. That, of course, through communication now, there's an element of which communication is always some level of performance, but there's a much bigger difference between a one-to-one and a one-to-many.
Yeah.
And of course, with the posts that happen with social media, you're now posting out into the ether, and it's this slow and or sometimes fast, superficial response that are like emojis, which is very different than the serve and return, they call it give and, back and forth conversation, which is actually developmentally doing something for you as an individual in relationship, as opposed to, in a sense, it's more theatrics. Let me post who I am and be observed, which actually then shifts it into a commodification, because in some ways you're now being observed and objectified, as opposed to what I would argue are two subjects are, discussing and a give and take. And so in this placing ourselves out into the ether, and of course it was called Facebook, at least, now Meta and, other names for social media posts, but it became a book of faces. And interestingly, you could almost say our faces are a new kind of currency, because they're everywhere in a way that with the faces being everywhere, they kind of lose their meaning because they're actually tied to real people that we just now actually quickly scroll past or, scroll up and down,
right,
left, right, swipe, whatever. And it's an objectification. So that's my concern. It's kind of like, I'm thinking of Michael Sandel. He talks about, in a market economy, everything's for sale.
Right.
And there's an interesting way that we have made ourselves part of this attention economy.
Absolutely.
Where we are being watched and watching others and not necessarily knowing and being known.
Yeah, and I guess, that would lead to the phenomenon where people on the internet will say and do things that they would never say or do in physical space to someone.
That's right. That's right.
Are very willing to say the most derogatory things, but in person would never actually say those things. And you're absolutely right. I do think about the ways that we have actually, by participating in these websites and these networks, we are allowing them to sell us, actually, right? So they're selling our attention to advertisers or, whomever. And that is where we actually become the product. And so to say that it's objectifying, it's objectifying all the way down, right? We're objectifying one another. We're being objectified. Because everything is for sale.
That's right. Our data is for sale, which is kind of a cloud that's a representation of us, but it's not our true selves.
Right.
That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah. All with the wonderful irony that this will be posted to all of those channels. We are going to break it down into small chunks for people to try and catch them on the algorithm and loop them in. Maybe we can say something a little bit later about whether or not that's even an ethical thing for us to be doing today.
Yes. Good question.
A cause for self-reflection.
That's right. No, I thought about that. That's correct.
Okay. So now Augustine's order of love, you say, poses differentiation as the necessary ingredient for proper self-assessment. One must love something or someone radically different from oneself to discover identity and belonging through divine recognition. How does Augustine's view of love of God, neighbor, and self contribute to a proper self-assessment? So the question is, if you're in this place where you're constantly selling yourself
Mm-hmm.
in one way or another,
Mhm.
consciously or not,
Mhm.
then there is a real self-focus there.
That's
and you're not having that mirrored other
Mhm. That's right.
next to you. So
That's right.
talk to us about then that importance of that differentiation, both between you and another person and between you and God.
Thank you. Yeah, no, there's a lot there. And there's a way sociologists, and, I've referenced Sherry Turkle quite a bit, but she really talks about alterity or difference. You see this in Emmanuel Levinas as well. The importance of difference and a sense of, we might argue, self-recognition. It's the between selves, the identity is formed. And I think a lot about childhood psychology, and even, I have a young 2-year-old again, and going through the young stage, and little ones learn their world by their encounter with another. And, we come into the world seeking a face. Andy Crouch describes that, but, the experience of looking for a face to be known and to be loved by caregivers. And so this gaze of face to face is so significant in our development, both for, the human brain and our wiring of attachments, but also it's the way we come to learn the world around us as we grow. So whether it's the child learning their sibling, or the child seeing themselves in the mirror for the first time and not knowing it's themselves. So you need a difference in order for an identity to be forged in community. And the way I've taught Augustine in the Confessions for years is there's a way in which you open the Confessions, and that's really what the whole project is himself learning who he is through this beautiful opening line that's going to carry on throughout the entire of the message, right? You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. And it's, for Augustine, it's this search. It's a looking back at his life, past, present. And of course, it's a dialogue. So he's inviting us into a prayer, his conversation with God, and it's saying, who am I? And then he'll break out into a song of praise of God. Oh, you, Lord. And of course, it's the learning of himself and looking back at his history and saying, this is who I was because of who you were. So it's this deep referential project. In some ways, all of life is reference to this final end. It's deeply teleological, goal-oriented, as well as from our origins, right? And it's so to know oneself is to know who God is, and then to come back, and then that actually frees us as creatures. And it's not one of found of objectivity, but of deep love, right? Being created in God's image. And so it's learning that, learning himself through learning who God is, this difference where he really receives the fullness of his identity, I would argue, in this kind of divine recognition.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to ask a follow-up question for the Augustine nerds out there. So one, and this was maybe more prevalent 20, 30 years ago, but one critique of Augustine would be you can sort of trace a line from Cartesian interiority and the sort of split between spirit and matter or something, all the way back to Augustine, specifically in the Confessions, as this kind of turn to the interior, which leads to a kind of isolation from the other, from the rest of the world, which leads to individualism, which gets us Facebook. So I suppose there is an alternative genealogy here in which Augustine is actually the progenitor of all the problems. And so I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about your reading of Augustine, and if you would come to his defense in this regard, or how you would respond to that critique.
That's very helpful. And that is a strong critique of Augustine, and one made for years. I do think in some ways I have different experiences of reading Augustine at different schools of thought along my academic training. And it really was more when I was at Boston College that I began to learn about this renaissance of Augustinian scholarship that began to see the incarnation and Christology as very central. And of course, he's arguing himself against Manichaean dualisms.
Right.
He's arguing against this kind of dualistic approach. And now, while you can certainly see he is influenced by Neoplatonism, there is no doubt about that. And even, you could critique me. I appreciate his Neoplatonism and his understanding of evil and things like that.
Yeah.
And yet, he is not Neoplatonic all the way down, because he is, it's transcendence, but he's going to have the incarnation as central, as well as the role of the body, resurrected bodies, this is my prior book work, but the role of the emotions actually will be significant for him in conversation with some of his, or difference in some of his interlocutors. And you see this in City of God, book 14. So there are a variety of reasons I find him more robust than the dualisms that we often place him in, sometimes this side of modernity. Although I understand why we do that some, and there's a way in which I hope we can draw out more of this incarnational dynamic to Augustine.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. All right. So that was for the nerds. In chapter 2, so let's come back to this question of technology then, which obviously Augustine didn't have access to.
Okay, right. No, that's correct.
So, but in chapter 2, you define technopoly as occurring, quote, when technology becomes the primary mode and meaning of knowledge, end quote. So in what ways does technology stand in contrast with Augustine's ideas of curiosity, spectacle, or disordered love?
Yes, great question. So, I mean, this book is certainly rooted in Augustinian anthropology, but I include so many other sources. And Neil Postman was prophetic, many other voices, with critiquing really in the 80s and 90s, technology, quoting Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. And his understanding of technopoly was that, it changes society because it begins to change our symbols and our understanding. And of course, this is the Jacques Ellul idea as well, that efficiency really became the primary mode of understanding, whether you call it bureaucracy or citing statistics, all of these things. And so part of what I appreciate about Postman is he says we lived in an information age where information was everywhere. And of course, he's primarily talking about the television, as well as an image-based culture.
Right.
And what I appreciate so much about from his work that I think is significant, particularly in my chapter 2 gets into this, is he talks about with the telegraph was the first time the information was separated from context. And so you could now send a short message across as fast as railway, basically, away from the local experience in which this information would have made sense. And so when information is separated from context, it becomes a thing, which becomes commodified. And we could say the same thing about image with photography, right? You can now, it's an amazing invention. You can take a snapshot of time and space, right? Isolate it. It's an incredible thing when I can see images of my own children or family who I have a relationship with. But now we have images everywhere that are decontextualized again and surfacing around the internet. And there's a way in which we are bombarded with information. So we have so much knowledge, but that doesn't mean we have wisdom. And that doesn't mean we know how to interpret all of this information. And in fact, we're over fatigued, I would argue, with the information that's just bombarding us.
Yeah. So let's drill down on this question of image then, because you do argue that this world of where everything is coming at us with images all the time, we're being constantly bombarded by images, that in that world that's going to affect how we think about the image of God, and humans is made in the image of God.
Yes.
So could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, certainly part of why I wrote this project, and I'm thinking of this in chapter 3 and then moving into 4, is just this idea of, in many ways, we're looking at an image of the image. So there's a way in which we now have, ironically, a mediator between faces that have now separated the individual face to face, mediators. So I'm looking at an image of the image, which interestingly is actually a distortion and easier to become objectified, as opposed to a direct encounter with the image of God. And of course, I talk about creation being in the world that is also a revelation. So, I want to in some ways help us to refocus and look at the world that we're in and elevate and recognize actually the profundity of being interpersonal face to face.
Yeah. And I guess if you think about Augustine's, the totus Christus, or the sense that, the church is very much the body of Christ.
That's right.
And so to encounter another person is to encounter Christ and is to encounter God in that person.
That's right.
And so you're actually, I suppose one way of expanding what you're saying here would be to say that if you're only interacting with people through this medium of technology that is itself distorting, then you're actually now degrading your own experience of God.
Yes.
Because you're not experiencing God through other people to the fullest extent that that's possible.
Yes.
Through actual face-to-face interaction.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
And I wonder then, what role does the church have in following up on this question about the church? What role does the church have in training us in resistance and practices of resistance to this?
This really gets into, what is the beauty of face-to-face. And I mean, in many ways, it's why the central aspect of the book and why I wrote the book is the role of presence. The Hebrew term panim can be translated both presence or face. And you see this as a significant concept across Scripture, whether it's, Joseph seeing his brothers and then forgiving them because he sees their faces, Jacob and Esau, Moses, not seeing the face of God, but there's something profound, and yet there's a back and forth of this idea. And then you move to the New Testament where it talks about the glory of God in the face of Christ.
Right.
Which, what does it mean to encounter the divine who walked among us? And then that moves out into what is then the practices of communion, which was both an ordinary and extraordinary meal. When we think of the Last Supper, but the Christ among the disciples. And then when we commune together, really gets back to this, there's transcendence in both the practice as well as the body being together. Imaging Christ to one another. Yeah. So this is where the church, and this is another way that Augustine wouldn't be just Cartesian or individualist.
Right.
But this idea that the body of Christ together, it's a formational space that we can prayerfully, hopefully, encounter one another and be changed, that there's transformative opportunity in those encounters.
Yeah. So I know this is maybe a difficult practical question to answer, but one of the things that COVID created, but also sort of revealed was possible, was that we could all gather for these things electronically,
right,
by distance, online. We have class online.
That's right.
I recorded a lecture for my students at like 9 p.m. after this conference one night and posted it to Canvas for them to do their thing, So
right.
If we can do all of that remotely, I would understand you to be rather hesitant about that as maybe a default mode of operating, but maybe talk to us about how churches can specifically navigate both the possibilities and the perils of remote worship.
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, this is a conversation for the community. This is an ongoing conversation in our culture at this time. But yes, like you, I am teaching multiple modalities. So I teach the recorded lectures that are asynchronous. I teach what we call digital live, where I have partial students in person and some that are, through Zoom, which actually is nice that it's synchronous. So there is a give and take. And then the live, which is where you have the most opportunity for spontaneous back and forth. But I will acknowledge, even when in higher ed, and particularly given the economy and factors, I recognize why we provide different modalities, and students are often, hopefully, being incarnational and present in their church communities and serving their church communities. So the point is that we are leading toward relational living, so to speak. So, and I have found most students are more dissatisfied with, there's a mix of online worship, or at least encouraging in this season of history, more in-person fellowship. Because the temptation, I would argue, is that the more you are worshiping online and perhaps displaced, other than for health reasons and hopefully even with health reasons, you have both parishioners, congregants, and pastoral staff that are still in relationship with and communing with and these kinds of pastoral care.
Right.
But the concern is that the more we're removed, the more we begin to, just like our relationships, wrap Christianity around ourselves, which is a danger.
Yeah.
As opposed to, it's really the difference, which you would encounter someone, the divine who's different than you, humans that are different than you, that actually for your sanctification and your good is the growth through the friction, the challenges of life, not seeking the easy path that is away from conflict, but it's actually, it's centered to our belief is a cross and resurrection, is the recognition that there is difficulty, there is conflict, and then there's the hope of growth and forgiveness. So these are central to our beliefs, but we in our humanity shy away from the challenge, and that's where tech can become a mask. And this is where the church needs to be prophetic and say, know we need to be together and seek ways to be together. So whether that's in education, I really love my intensive courses where I get to be more in person, maybe even for a short amount of time. But even it's the idea of trying to be present with one another so that we are connected to real people, not bots and or simply images, but real people through space and time,
right?
So we can be changed.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so I said we'd come back to this, but we're beaming these images out to the world eventually after we edit them and all of that.
Right.
And we're breaking them into smaller chunks to continue to erode people's attention spans.
Yeah.
That's kind of the name of the game here.
Yeah.
All so that they will go and buy your book,
Correct.
So
there's the irony here.
Yes. What are we doing this all wrong? And should we just give up? Or how,
That's a great
how
question.
do we live maybe in the world and not of it? How do we live in this world of technology without allowing it to devour us?
And that is, had to in some ways come and land the plane. That's chapter 6, is this idea how we're not escaping it. I don't think we're going back in time. And yet, can we live more wisely in this moment? And that is where the order of love is helpful, because it doesn't say either all this or all that. Temperance in a sense is about balance, but in the order of love, you are seeking what is it you're directed toward, so you can use technology for good ends. And there are certainly very malicious ends and ways of connecting through tech. So the hope is, of course, and this is why everything from missiologists to, church services, the argument was, well, we're, promoting good content.
Yeah.
So I'm not, and this is a larger ecclesial discussion across ecumenical across different, churches, but you can produce good things, but the question would be, that's not where you want to end. And so even in this, we're promoting this idea. My hope is that it will be edifying, but even in that, we do have to acknowledge irony of participating in the digital empire, even if we're hoping for good ends.
Sure.
So,
well, I suppose one recommendation would be to buy the book, physical copies, so you can hold it and smell it and have it, and then buy 3 more books and give them to your friends and family, and then have a book club and talk about it face to face. Maybe that's the solution here.
That's right. Talk.
Somehow I turned that into buy 5 books instead of buy 1. But Autumn, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Congratulations on your new book. We're very excited about it.
Thank you.
Buy Autumn Ridenour's latest book, Restlessness and Belonging, at BaylorPress.com. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.